The year is 1987, and morning fog blankets the Pacific Northwest like a living curtain across endless evergreens. Two seasoned pilots take off on a routine flight. Thomas Tommy Dennis Harmano and ten vanish med det ved trace. No wreckage, no borders, no final coordinates. Radio transmissions crackle, dist aired, and cut out mid-sentence, leaving only static behind. Cirque plane sweeps the forest canopy for days, 10 weeks, finding nothing but miles of wet trees and empty sky. 6 months later, one motor refuses the official explanation and follows whispers toward the Kommission und Militärbase, where sie Hangar weizen sie längse.
The year was 1987, and the Pacific Northwest was alive with the soft hum of morning fog. A cold mist rolled over the dense evergreen trees, the kind that obscures your vision but doesn't make you feel lost. It's the kind of fog that feels almost welcoming, a blanket over the world. Yet, beneath the fog's veil, something far more unsettling was happening. Two pilots, seasoned and familiar with the skies, vanished without a trace, leaving behind only unanswered questions. Thomas Tommy Daniels and Rachel Monroe had been flying together for years, both experienced, both reliable, and both passionate about their work. They weren't just colleagues. They were friends, bound by their shared love for aviation. The flight they were on that day wasn't anything out of the ordinary. A simple trip from one small-town airport to another, a journey they had made countless times before. But somewhere in the stillness of the fog, things went wrong. Tommy was at the controls. He'd been flying for over 10 years with an impeccable record. Rachel, sitting beside him, was his co-pilot and confidant. She had just as much experience, a steady hand in the air, and a clear head when navigating the most complicated weather conditions. If there was anyone you'd want with you in the cockpit during a storm or fog, it was Rachel. She had an intuition for the sky. She knew when to trust the instruments and when to trust her gut. Together, they were a perfect team. But this time, something was different. As they approached the destination, radio signals became increasingly erratic, their transmissions garbled and broken. The last communication that was made was a brief transmission that cut off mid-sentence, a strange distortion in the sound. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary. There had been moments like this before, especially with the unpredictable weather in the region. But what made this different was that, in that moment, no one heard from him again. Search teams were quickly mobilized, combing the vast, fog-cloaked forests of the Pacific Northwest. The search was exhaustive, involving dozens of aircraft volunteers and tracking dogs. They searched for days, then weeks, then months. But there was no trace. No wreckage, no bodies, no sign of the aircraft. The investigation became a study in frustration. Reports filed, evidence that led nowhere, theories that piled up but remained unsupported. The authorities quickly labeled it an accident, the product of poor visibility, the fog swallowing up any sign of the plane's crash. But deep down, there was something unsettling about it all. The air was heavy with the unspoken understanding that something didn't add up. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the families were left with nothing but silence. Rachel's mother, Joanne, was the first to question the official explanation. She couldn't understand how, in a world so full of eyes watching from the ground, a plane could simply disappear. The thought of it gnawed at her, an insistent whisper in the back of her mind. How could a plane, with two experienced pilots, simply vanish into thin air? Her grief was immediate, but it didn't come with the closure that one might expect after such a loss. Instead, it was swallowed up in questions that had no answers, in an emptiness that was consuming. For the first time in her life, Joanne realized that grief could be a presence unto itself, a living, breathing thing that haunted the spaces between breaths, between thoughts. She was drawn into a quiet obsession, not with the mourning process itself, but with the need to uncover something, anything, that could give her the answers she was so desperately seeking. Her daughter, her only child, had disappeared without a trace. How could she accept that? How could she rest knowing there was no explanation? Frank Daniels, Tommy's father, had a different response. He seemed to retreat into silence. Frank was a stoic man by nature, someone who kept his emotions close to the chest. But this was different. He was unreachable. He didn't speak much in those early days after the disappearance. almost as if he were trying to shut the world out, as if by not speaking he could keep the pain at bay. The disappearance was too much for him to confront. The idea that his son was simply gone was a reality he couldn't wrap his mind around. Maybe it was easier to simply not think about it, to let the grief remain unspoken, untouched. But as the months turned into years, his silence became a heavy weight, a quiet rift in the family that grew deeper with each passing day. The official search eventually ended, a casualty of resources running dry and time fading into uncertainty. Without any concrete leads, the authorities were forced to scale back their efforts. The case, as they saw it, was simply a tragic accident. One of those things that happens in a world where the air and the weather are unpredictable, where sometimes things slip through the cracks and disappear. But Joanne couldn't accept that explanation. To her, it didn't make sense. Something had to be out there, some shred of evidence, something that could explain what had happened to her daughter and Tommy. The uncertainty, the lack of closure, was too unbearable. But the years passed. Time, it seemed, had its way of dulling the edges of pain. The memory of the pilots began to fade in the eyes of the public. And for many, their disappearance was just another cold case, a mystery that never found its answer. The world moved on, and so did the families, at least on the surface. Rachel's mother returned to a semblance of normal life, though her every step seemed haunted by the unanswered questions. Frank remained distant, his grief unspoken but deeply present, hidden in his silent gaze. Yet for Joanne, the need to know, despite the passage of time, never left. She found herself unable to move forward in the same way everyone else seemed to have. Her mind continued to spin, wrestling with the idea that there was more to this story than anyone had been willing to admit. There was something else out there, something no one had uncovered yet. The truth, she felt, had to be out there, somewhere in the fog, waiting to be uncovered. This was the emotional seed that would eventually grow into an obsession, the drive that would push her to pursue answers no matter the cost. The years spent searching, the long silences, the quiet grief, they were all building to something. And somewhere deep down, Joanne knew it. The truth had to come out. 6 months had passed since the plane vanished, and for the families of Tommy Daniels and Rachel Monroe, the absence felt more like an open wound than a memory. Each day that ticked by added another layer to the grief, until it became something more than sorrow. It became a silent, gnawing presence that haunted their every thought. For most people, time helps heal wounds, softens the sharpest edges of pain, and eventually allows for a kind of resignation. But for Joanne Monroe, Rachel's mother, time had done nothing but leave her in a constant state of limbo, suspended between hope and despair, between the yearning for answers and the fear of what those answers might bring. Joanne's life had been turned upside down, and though the world around her moved forward, she felt as though she were walking in place. Her friends, her family, even the neighbors, everyone seemed to move on with their lives, and the pain of loss faded in their eyes, replaced by the normal rhythms of daily life. But Joanne wasn't like them. She couldn't be. The unanswered question still lingered in her mind like a persistent echo. How could a plane, piloted by 2 experienced individuals, simply disappear? How could there be no trace, no wreckage, no sign of their final moments? The official explanation, an accident in bad weather, had always felt insufficient to her. Something was wrong, something didn't fit, and deep down Joanne knew it. She found herself obsessively replaying every detail, every conversation, every moment leading up to the flight. What had Tommy said to her the day before? What did Rachel look like when she kissed her goodbye that morning? Joanne could not stop the mental loop of these questions. She needed to understand. But more than that, she needed to do something. Anything, other than wait for the world to forget. The silence was unbearable. It made the grief feel infinite, like an open wound that no one else could see. Frank Daniels, Tommy's father, had reacted differently. Where Joanne's grief drove her into action, Frank seemed to retreat. He became a shadow of the man he had once been, quiet, distant, and lost in his own sorrow. Tommy had always been his pride, his joy, the son who followed in his footsteps and grew into an exceptional pilot. Frank's sense of loss was profound, but his way of coping with it was to withdraw, to avoid confronting it directly. He stopped talking about Tommy, stopped sharing memories, stop engaging with the process of grieving. Instead, he built a wall around himself, one made of silence and stoicism, and let the years slip by without ever acknowledging the pain that had shattered his world. Joanne, in contrast, couldn't let it go. The pain of losing her daughter wasn't something she could ignore, and the absence of answers only made it worse. It was like a gnawing hunger deep inside of her, one that couldn't be satisfied by simply mourning or accepting what had happened. She had to know what happened to Rachel and Tommy. She needed the truth, no matter how uncomfortable or dangerous it might be. After a few months, Joanne found herself reaching out to anyone who might have information, even if it was just a rumor or a whisper. She contacted people who had worked at the airport, retired officials who had once been part of the search team, and even those who had been involved in other mysterious disappearances in the region. She made phone calls, wrote letters, and spent hours poring over old news articles, trying to find some piece of information that hadn't yet been uncovered. The official investigation, as she had come to understand, had essentially come to a halt, but there were still people out there who might know something. People who hadn't been part of the public search and hadn't yet been silenced by the passage of time. Joanne's search, though it lacked any immediate results, became all-consuming. She began to look into the records surrounding the flight itself, poring over the weather reports, the flight logs, and the details of the aircraft that Tommy and Rachel had been flying. Every small detail seemed significant, and Joanne clung to each new fragment of information like it was a lifeline. But the more she dug, the more she felt the weight of a much larger mystery pressing down on her. There were gaps in the records, inconsistencies in the reports, and things that simply didn't add up. Why had the search for the missing plane been called off so quickly? Why were there no follow-up investigations into the apparent failure of the aircraft's instruments during the flight? And why did no one seem to want to talk about the military base located nearby? Joanne had always known that the world had its secrets. Secrets that people didn't always want to acknowledge, but she never imagined that it would be something as sinister as what she was beginning to suspect. There were whispers in the small town she lived in, whispers about a nearby military base that had once been home to classified operations. The base had been decommissioned years before, but its role in the community was anything but forgotten. People talked about strange flights, late-night arrivals of aircraft that no one had ever seen before, and rumors of secret cargo being transported through the area. No one could prove anything, but there were enough stories floating around to make Joanne wonder if there was a connection. Could Rachel and Tommy have been flying something they weren't supposed to? Were they involved in something far larger than they ever realized? Frank, of course, didn't share these suspicions. He had no interest in looking for answers. In his mind, the disappearance was simply a tragic accident, and the pain of confronting anything more complicated was something he wasn't willing to bear. He withdrew further into himself, making the divide between him and Joanne even more apparent. The tension between them grew as Joanne became more fixated on uncovering the truth, while Frank seemed content to live in the silence of his grief. They no longer spoke much, their once comfortable relationship fractured by their differing ways of coping with the loss. Months had passed since Joanne Monroe began her search for answers, and though the landscape of her grief had shifted, the need for truth had only grown stronger. Her days blurred together in a haze of research, phone calls, and cold leads. Yet, despite the mounting frustration, something had shifted inside her. She was no longer simply trying to find out what happened to her daughter. Now, she was beginning to feel as though there was a larger mystery at play, something far beyond a simple plane crash. It was almost as if the deeper she dug, the more shadows appeared around the case, as if the very act of uncovering answers had opened a door to a world that didn't want to be seen. It was then one quiet afternoon when she received a letter that would change everything. The envelope, old and weathered, arrived with no return address, just a simple typewritten message inside. The words were few, but they carried a weight that immediately set her heart racing. "The truth about your daughter's flight is hidden behind a wall you don't know exists," it read. "Start looking at the military base nearby. There are people who know what happened to Rachel and Tommy, but they'll never speak unless you find the key." Joanne's hands trembled as she read the letter again, the edges of the paper starting to curl with the moisture of her sweat. It was as if the universe had reached out to her, offering a clue, an invitation to a deeper layer of the story. But who had sent this? And why now after all this time? The message was cryptic, filled with hints and shadows, but it spoke directly to something Joanne had begun to suspect. The disappearance of Rachel and Tommy wasn't just an accident. It wasn't a tragedy born of bad weather. It was part of something far bigger. And now, someone was telling her exactly where to look. The letter became her obsession. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was real, that there was something to it, despite how strange and unsettling it seemed. The military base, Joanne had heard rumors about it over the years, whispered stories of classified flights, of strange cargo, and of people who came and went under the cover of night. The base was small, unassuming, and abandoned by the public's eye, but it had once been a crucial part of a much larger operation during the Cold War. After its decommissioning, it had largely faded from public memory, but not from the minds of those who had been involved in its more secretive operations. Joanne had always known that there was something about the place that didn't sit right with her. She had even wondered, in the darkest corners of her mind, if the disappearance of her daughter was somehow linked to it. But until now, she had never been able to prove it. Now, with the letter in hand, she had a new direction, a new lead that felt too important to ignore. The words were clear. There are people who know what happened to Rachel and Tommy, but they'll never speak unless you find the key. The key. Joanne didn't fully understand what that meant, but she knew she had to start looking at the military base. The problem, however, was that the base had been closed off to the public for decades. It was shrouded in secrecy, and anyone who might have worked there was either gone or unwilling to talk. Determined, Joanne began researching the base, digging into old records and trying to piece together any information she could find. She combed through archives, sent letters to former employees, and reached out to anyone with knowledge of the place. Most of the responses were dead ends, dismissive, uninterested, or outright hostile. But there were occasional moments, fragment of information, that kept her going. One was a rumor from a former mechanic who had worked at the base, who spoke of an off-limits hangar, a place that had never appeared on any public maps. This hangar, he said, was sealed years ago, and no one had been allowed near it since. He couldn't say exactly what had been inside, but the way he spoke it suggested that there was something in there that no one was meant to see. That word, sealed, stuck with Joanne. Sealed, like a secret that could never be opened, like the truth she was trying so desperately to uncover. At first, Joanne wasn't sure where to turn next. She knew that she couldn't just walk up to the base and demand answers. She wasn't even sure she had the right to be there. But the more she thought about it, the more certain she became that the sealed hangar held the answers she had been searching for. She began to dig deeper into connections between the military base and the flight her daughter had been on. She discovered that the base had been involved in testing various experimental aircraft and military technologies, some of which were never publicly acknowledged. In the years following the Cold War, the base had slowly fallen into obscurity, but its history was anything but ordinary. There were mentions of aircraft that had never been seen before, of strange cargo being transported to the area in the dead of night, and of operations that were never fully explained. It was clear to Joanne that the pilots, Tommy and Rachel, had somehow been caught in the crossfire of something far larger than they had ever known. Joanne's mind raced as she connected the dots. If Rachel and Tommy had been flying that plane, was it possible that they had been unknowingly involved in something classified, something that went beyond their control? The idea seemed far-fetched, but the more she uncovered, the more it made sense. What if the disappearance wasn't an accident? What if the plane had been taken down because of something far more sinister? She began to feel as though the pieces were coming together, but they were still scattered, incomplete. The sealed hangar remained a key, but how would she ever get inside? She started making plans to visit the base. She knew she couldn't do it alone, so she enlisted the help of a retired officer who had worked at the base years ago. His name was Walter Reed, and he had been stationed there during the early 1970s. He had seen things, he told her, things that no one had ever spoken about publicly. The days that followed were filled with a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. Joanne's resolve had solidified into something unshakable, though she was well aware of the risks. The military base, once a cold, secretive place, now felt like the final frontier of her search. It was clear to her now. She was no longer just a grieving mother trying to piece together fragments of a shattered life. She had become a detective in her own right, chasing down whispers and forgotten trails. The sealed hangar, hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and old military protocol, had become her singular obsession. The truth about Rachel and Tommy's disappearance had to be within its walls. She could feel it in her bones. Joanne's first step was reaching out to Walter Reed again. Their last conversation had left her with a strange mix of hope and confusion. Walter had confirmed the existence of the sealed hangar, but had also warned her about how tightly guarded the base had become in the years since it was decommissioned. It wasn't just that no one talked about the base. It was that talking about it had become a dangerous thing. Walter, despite his reluctance to get involved, had shared a piece of information that had set the gears in motion. "There are places in that base you can't even get near anymore," he had said, his voice low and cautious, like he was afraid someone might be listening. "The kind of places where secrets are meant to stay buried. Whatever happened to your daughter and Tommy, it's buried under all of that." The last sentence had been a knife twisting in her gut. Whatever happened, those words felt like a dark omen. But Joanne wasn't afraid of whatever that truth might be. She had long ago come to terms with the fact that there was no going back to the way things were. Rachel and Tommy were gone. The world they had known was gone. What was left now was uncovering the truth, no matter how painful or dangerous it might be. So, Joanne arranged a trip to the base with Walter, planning everything down to the smallest detail. The plan was simple, but it carried an undeniable sense of urgency. They would enter under the guise of being curious civilians, as though they were just two people with an interest in the history of the place. The likelihood of gaining access to the base was slim, and even if they did, there was no guarantee that they would find anything. But the sealed hangar was still the prize, the one place where she could sense something lurking, just waiting to be discovered. She had to see it for herself. They drove the long, winding road toward the base, the air thick with tension. The once abandoned roads leading to the site now felt like a journey into the heart of a forgotten chapter in history. Joanne couldn't help but wonder about the people who had once walked these grounds, the soldiers and officers who'd been part of a world she had never known. What had they seen? What had they kept hidden? The thought that Rachel and Tommy might have unknowingly become part of this dark world only added to the sense of unease that gripped her chest. They were innocent. Two young pilots doing their job, and yet they had found themselves in the middle of something far larger than they could have ever imagined. Walter was quiet as they approached the base, his face unreadable. He had told her little about the place itself, save for a few vague warnings about what lay inside. The closer they got, the more Joanne could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her. This wasn't just a trip to uncover the truth about her daughter. It was a journey into a hidden history that no one wanted to talk about. She felt like an intruder. But at the same time, she felt that she had no choice. This was the only way. They arrived at the base late in the afternoon, when the fading light cast long shadows over the crumbling structures. The place was eerily quiet, as though it had long since surrendered to time. There were no guards, no signs of life, just the skeletal remains of a once vibrant military installation. The buildings, overgrown with ivy and moss, looked like relics from another era. Joanne felt a chill run through her as they passed by rows of old hangars and abandoned bunkers. This place, she realized, was not only a graveyard for military secrets. It was a tomb for memories buried under layers of dust and silence. Walter led the way, his steps cautious but determined. He seemed to know exactly where he was going, though he never spoke much along the way. Joanne's eyes scanned every corner, every shadow, wondering if they were being watched, if there were eyes hidden behind the ruins, waiting to stop them. The base had been closed off to the public for years, and any security that remained was likely designed to keep people like her away. But Joanne was undeterred. She had come too far to turn back now. The air around them felt heavy, as though the very land was holding its breath. As they approached the section of the base that Walter had mentioned, the buildings seemed to take on a more foreboding quality. The hangars here were larger, older, their doors sealed shut with thick chains and padlocks. It was clear that no one had set foot inside in a long time. Yet, despite the decay, there was a sense of something still alive within these walls, a pulse faint but unmistakable. When they reached the area near the sealed hangar, Walter stopped. He turned to Joanne, his face tight with apprehension. "This is as close as we can get," he said quietly. "The hangar is behind that wall. No one's been in there for decades." Joanne nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She could almost feel the secrets pressing against the walls of the hangar, waiting to be released. She didn't say anything to Walter. There was no need. They both knew what had to be done. The question was no longer whether she could uncover the truth. It was whether she was ready to face it. And as she stood there, staring at the cracked walls, the years of grief, the unanswered questions, the countless nights spent wondering what had happened to Rachel and Tommy, all of it came rushing to the surface. The hours that followed felt like a blur. Joanne's pulse hammered in her ears as she and Walter made their way through the military base. Each step brought them closer to a confrontation with the truth, yet it also brought them closer to the realization that they were standing at the edge of a precipice, one they could never unstand. As they approached the hangar, the oppressive silence of the base seemed to stretch further, wrapping itself around them like an unseen force, pulling them deeper into the heart of something that had been hidden for far too long. Joanne felt a tremor in her chest, but it wasn't fear. It was a culmination of years of unanswered questions, years of pain, and years of a grief that had turned into something darker. She wasn't just stepping into the past. She was stepping into a future that had been locked away, a future that had been silenced. She was about to discover what had been kept from her, what had been buried behind layers of secrecy, layers of time. Every instinct in her screamed that this was it, that whatever she was about to find would forever change the course of her life. Yet, even as the weight of that certainty pressed down on her, she couldn't bring herself to look away. There was no turning back. The sealed hangar loomed ahead, its rusted walls and cracked windows shrouded in the shadows of an uncertain past. The air was thick with the smell of decay, a scent that clung to the crumbling structure, as though the hangar itself had been abandoned by both time and memory. Joanne could feel the oppressive history of the place surrounding her, the years of silence and neglect that had settled into the bones of the building. She had expected the hangar to feel like a relic, something old and forgotten, but it felt far more alive than that. The past wasn't something distant here. It was right in front of her, as tangible and real as the ground beneath her feet. Walter had led her to a small, overgrown path that wound its way toward a faded steel door, one that had been all but swallowed by ivy and moss. It was almost as though nature itself had conspired to conceal whatever lay behind it. For a moment, Joanne wondered if the door would open at all, if the secrets it held inside were destined to remain locked away forever. But as Walter moved toward the door and reached for the rusted handle, Joanne realized that the moment had come. They were about to breach something that had been sealed away for decades. With a creak of metal and a groan of resistance, the door began to open, the sound of it scraping against the frame echoing through the otherwise silent air. It was as if the hangar itself was waking up, groaning from years of slumber, ready to reveal what had been buried in its depths. Joanne's heart raced, her hands trembling as she stepped forward, feeling the weight of her every movement. She could hear Walter's breath behind her, shallow and quick, but she didn't turn to look at him. She couldn't afford to. Her gaze was fixed firmly ahead on the darkened interior of the hangar, where shadows seemed to flicker and twist like something alive. The door swung open wider, and the first thing that hit Joanne was the cold. It was a chill that cut through her layers, biting into her skin as if the air inside had been frozen in time. The light from the outside world barely reached the farthest corners of the hangar, and the space inside seemed to stretch endlessly, the shadows playing tricks on her eyes. But even in the dim light, Joanne could see the remnants of a forgotten past. There were crates stacked haphazardly against the walls, some with markings that had long since faded, and old equipment strewn across the floor like forgotten relics from another age. But there was one thing that stood out amid the clutter. A large, imposing structure near the back of the hangar, something covered by a faded tarp, its outline unmistakable. Joanne's breath caught in her throat. This was it. Whatever it was the key. It was the thing that had been hidden away, the thing that had caused everything to be locked up in this forgotten place. Without a word, she began to move toward it, her feet leading her with a certainty she had not known before. The tarp hung loosely over the structure, its edges frayed and torn, and Joanne could almost feel the weight of the secret it was concealing. Walter moved to follow her, but stopped just a few paces behind, as if unsure whether he should be part of this moment, part of the revelation. He had warned her that they might not like what they found, but it was too late for second thoughts now. Joanne had come this far, and she wasn't about to turn back. With shaking hands, she reached for the edge of the tarp, the fabric cold and rough under her fingers. As she pulled it back, a sense of unease washed over her, a knowing that whatever was beneath it would answer questions but create even more. She tugged away in one swift motion, the fabric sliding off to reveal the object beneath. What she saw sent a shiver through her entire body. It wasn't just an ordinary aircraft. It was something else entirely. A strange, angular plane, one she had never seen before, sat in front of her, its surface sleek and black, almost reflecting the dim light of the hangar. The aircraft was unlike anything Joanne had ever imagined. It looked advanced, far beyond anything that was commercially available at the time. It was almost too perfect, too otherworldly, as though it belonged to a future that had never materialized. But that wasn't what struck her most. It was the markings on the side, faint but unmistakable, that made her stomach drop. The same markings that had appeared in the flight logs Rachel and Tommy had been using. The realization hit Joanne like a physical blow. This was it. This was the plane they had been flying. The plane that had disappeared. The plane that had never been found. But why had it been hidden here? Why had it been sealed away in this forgotten hangar, far from prying eyes? And more importantly, why had Rachel and Tommy been involved in something so clearly classified? As her mind raced with the implications of this discovery, Joanne took a step closer, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and awe. Joanne stood frozen, her body trembling as she stared at the aircraft, the weight of the discovery pressing down on her chest like an invisible force. Every thought in her mind collided with the truth she had just uncovered. This wasn't just any plane. It was the plane, the one Rachel and Tommy had been flying when they disappeared. And now, here it was, hidden away in a place where no one was ever supposed to find it. It was the missing piece of the puzzle, the thing that had eluded her for so long. And yet, in that moment, the more she looked at it, the more questions it raised. Walter's voice, low and strained, broke through the silence. "We have to leave. Now." But Joanne didn't move. She couldn't. The realization was like a rope tightening around her throat, cutting off her breath. She knew this wasn't an ordinary plane. She knew now that this wasn't just an accident, as everyone had told her. This wasn't just a result of bad weather or a tragic mistake. Rachel and Tommy had been caught up in something far bigger than they had ever imagined, something so large and secretive that it had cost them their lives. Walter stepped closer, his face etched with the same kind of fear that now gripped Joanne. "You have to understand," he said, his voice shaking. "This isn't just about your daughter and Tommy. This plane, it's part of something much darker. I never wanted to be involved in any of it, but I knew enough to stay away, and now you're here, and this is bigger than both of us." Joanne's mind raced, but it couldn't keep up with the magnitude of what she was hearing. She could barely take in his words, let alone process them. Her thoughts darted from one thing to the next. Rachel and Tommy, the mysterious markings on the plane, the secretive military base, the hidden hangar. Everything she thought she knew about her daughter's disappearance was being shattered in real time, piece by piece, like glass breaking against the floor. "What do you mean?" She finally managed to whisper, her voice hoarse with emotion. "What do you know about this plane? About what happened to them?" Walter glanced nervously over his shoulder, his gaze shifting back to the entrance of the hangar. "There's so much I never told you," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "So much I didn't want you to know. You wouldn't have believed me if I had. But now it's all here, and you need to understand." He took a deep breath before continuing, his voice low, almost reluctant. "This plane, it was part of a program, a secret military project. Not just any project, but one that involved testing experimental aircraft. They were building something, advanced, top secret, beyond anything the public knew about. They thought they could control it, but they didn't. And Rachel and Tommy, they didn't know. They were just doing their job, flying a routine mission, but they got caught up in something that had already gone terribly wrong." Joanne's stomach twisted as Walter spoke, the words sinking into her like ice. The very idea that Rachel and Tommy had been unknowingly flying a plane caught up in a classified military operation was almost too much to process. Her mind flashed to the countless hours she had spent looking at weather reports, talking to experts, replaying the final moments of their last communication. It had never made sense to her, and now it was beginning to. They didn't know? Joanne repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. They were just doing their job? Walter nodded, his expression grim. Yeah, but that's what makes this even worse. They didn't know they were flying a piece of technology that was way beyond anything that should have been out there. This wasn't an ordinary aircraft. It was military grade, and it was supposed to stay off the radar. But something went wrong. The system malfunctioned. The technology didn't work the way it was supposed to, and the result? Well, we both know the result. The weight of his words sank deeper into Joanne's bones. It was one thing to know that her daughter and Tommy had died, but to learn that they had been caught in a secret, deadly game that had nothing to do with them? It felt like a betrayal, one she had never imagined. She stood there for a long moment, trying to gather her thoughts, to make sense of the chaos that was spinning in her head. The more she learned, the more her questions multiplied. Why had they been selected to fly this plane? Was it truly just a mistake? Or had they been unknowingly drawn into a larger conspiracy? What had been the purpose of the mission? And why had they been left to disappear without a trace? Walter seemed to sense the storm of emotions brewing inside her. You need to understand, Joanne, he said, his voice softer now, almost apologetic. This isn't just about your daughter. There are people in high places who don't want this information getting out. They'll do whatever it takes to keep it buried, to protect the program, and to make sure that no one ever knows what really happened. The fact that you found this plane, changes everything. You can't go back to your life. They'll come for you. Joanne's heart pounded in her chest as the full weight of Walter's words settled in. The walls that had once seemed so distant, so unshakable, were closing in. It wasn't just the truth about Rachel and Tommy that had been hidden. It was everything about the program, the people involved, and the lives that had been shattered in the process. She had stumbled onto something far more dangerous than she could have imagined, and there was no escaping it now. I don't care, she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. I don't care what they'll do. I need to know what happened to my daughter. I need to understand why she and Tommy are gone. If this plane is part of it, then I have to find out everything. Walter shook his head, a mixture of fear and resignation in his eyes. You don't know what you're saying, Joanne. There are people who will do anything to keep this quiet. They've already erased records. Scrub clean any trace of what happened to those pilots. If you go down this path, there's no going back. The world seemed to fade away as Joanne stood in front of the plane, the full scope of the truth slowly unfurling inside her mind. What had once been a simple desire to find her daughter had now become a war against forces far larger, far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The hangar, once a forgotten relic, had now become the epicenter of a nightmare she could never have foreseen. Rachel and Tommy had been caught in a web of secrets, a covert operation that had cost them their lives. And standing here in this cold, dimly lit space, Joanne realized there was no going back. She had crossed a line, one that would lead her into an abyss of deception, corruption, and perhaps even her own destruction. Walter stood a few feet behind her, his eyes scanning the hangar, ever watchful, ever anxious. Joanne could feel the tension in his presence, his fear palpable, and yet there was no turning back for either of them now. They had uncovered something too dangerous, too volatile, and no matter how much Walter tried to warn her, she knew there was only one path left to walk. Her mind kept racing as she looked at the plane before her, the dark, sleek surface of it almost mocking her, as if daring her to understand the enormity of what it represented. This was not just any piece of military hardware. This was something that had been engineered in secrecy, designed for purposes unknown, with an agenda hidden from the world. And Rachel and Tommy had flown it without knowing its true nature. Had they been briefed on what they were transporting? Had they been given any inkling of the forces that had been set in motion the moment they had taken off? Joanne couldn't bear the thought of it. Her daughter and Tommy, so innocent, so unaware of the danger that had followed them into the sky. She stepped closer to the aircraft, her fingers brushing lightly against the cold surface of the fuselage. The markings on the side were faded, barely visible now, but they still sent a chill down her spine. She could make out a series of numbers and letters, an identifier that meant nothing to her, but which Walter had already recognized. "That's not a standard military aircraft," Walter said, his voice quiet but urgent. "This plane was made for one thing, and one thing only. You're looking at a prototype, Joanne. This is experimental tech, something they don't want anyone knowing about. And if we're not careful, they'll make sure that no one ever finds out about it." Joanne's heart tightened at his words. She had known, deep down, that this wasn't just a case of a lost plane. But hearing Walter confirm it in such a definitive way made everything feel so much more real, so much more dangerous. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about survival now. If she wanted to learn what happened to Rachel and Tommy, if she wanted to uncover the conspiracy that had taken their lives, she would have to fight a battle that stretched far beyond her personal grief. There were people who didn't want this secret to see the light of day, people who would stop at nothing to ensure it stayed buried. And Joanne knew that now, more than ever, the stakes had been raised. Her mind began to race through the possibilities. The aircraft, this mysterious plane, had been part of a classified program. That much was clear. But what kind of program was it? What was the purpose of this technology, and why had Rachel and Tommy been involved in its operation? The more Joanne thought about it, the more the pieces began to fit together. She had always known that something had been off about the way the investigation into Rachel and Tommy's disappearance had been handled. It had been brushed aside too quickly, as if the authorities were more interested in closing the case than uncovering the truth. And now she knew why. This was never just about them, was it? Joanne said, her voice trembling with the weight of her realization. This was about something bigger, something that they didn't even know about. Walter didn't answer immediately, and when he did, his words were thick with regret. Yeah, they didn't know what they were flying. They didn't know they were transporting something that wasn't meant to be found. But that's the thing. This plane wasn't supposed to be on that flight. Your daughter and Tommy weren't supposed to be flying it. There's a whole operation behind this, and their deaths weren't an accident. Joanne felt her blood run cold as the truth settled over her. Her mind flashed back to everything she had learned over the years. The strange circumstances surrounding the disappearance, the abrupt cessation of the search effort, the lack of any substantial leads. Now it all made sense. Rachel and Tommy had stumbled onto something that no one was supposed to know about, and for that, they had paid the ultimate price. The silence in the hangar felt suffocating. Joanne's eyes remained locked on the aircraft, but her mind was elsewhere, spinning with the implications of what Walter had said. How far did this go? Who was responsible for this covert operation? And most importantly, how could she expose it? The answers, she realized, were not going to be easy to find, and there was a deep, gnawing fear rising in her chest. Joanne had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed. Each passing moment now felt like a countdown, not toward an eventual resolution, but toward a confrontation with the unknown. The truth about Rachel and Tommy's disappearance was no longer just about finding out what had happened to them. That was just the beginning. The deeper she ventured into this dark underworld, the more she realized she was playing a game far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. What had started as a mother's search for closure had evolved into a battle against forces so entrenched in secrecy that she wasn't sure she could even begin to grasp their full power. She knew that Walter had been right. There was no turning back. Once they had discovered the plane, the prototype, the secretive military project, it was clear that the stakes were far higher than she had ever considered. The aircraft in front of her wasn't just a piece of military technology. It was a symbol of something far larger, something hidden, something that had cost Rachel and Tommy their lives. But what had they been carrying? What had they unknowingly flown, and why had it led to their deaths? Walter had tried to warn her. He'd told her how dangerous this path was, how the people behind the plane's development had protected their secrets with everything they had. But Joanne was already too far gone. She couldn't stop now. She had to uncover the truth. She had to bring justice to her daughter, to Tommy, to the families left in the dark about the true cause of their loved ones' disappearances. The hangar felt like a tomb now, each echo of her footsteps reverberating through the cold, empty space. She and Walter had been in the hangar for what felt like hours, but in reality, it had only been a matter of minutes. Time moved differently now, slow by the weight of the secrets that hung in the air. Joanne could feel it pressing down on her with each breath she took, the sense that the walls were closing in. The truth was just beyond reach, like an elusive shadow that refused to show itself fully. But she was determined to bring it into the light, no matter what it took. She couldn't shake the thought of Rachel, of how young and full of life she had been. A promising pilot with a future ahead of her, a daughter who had never asked to be part of some covert military operation. Tommy, too, his quiet strength and the bond he shared with Rachel. They had both been taken from this world for reasons far beyond their control, caught in the crossfire of a world they had no business being part of. And now, Joanne could almost feel their presence in the hangar, their spirits lingering in the shadows, urging her to finish what they had started. The air around her seemed to grow heavier, thicker, as if something unseen had entered the room. Walter moved uneasily behind her, shifting from foot to foot, eyes darting toward the entrance. Joanne could tell that he was wrestling with his own fear. The path they had chosen was one of no return. And even Walter, with his years of experience and knowledge of the base, couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. He had said it before, but now, as the minutes ticked by, it felt more real than ever. "I don't think we should stay here much longer," Walter finally said, his voice low, almost pleading. "We've seen what we need to see. If we leave now, maybe we can still get out of this without anyone noticing." Joanne didn't answer right away. Her eyes were still locked on the plane. She could feel the weight of it pulling her in, the unspoken words, the questions that had no answers. It was as if the plane was calling to her, asking her to look deeper, to understand what lay beneath the surface. "I can't leave yet," she said finally, her voice firm. "I'm not walking away until I know everything. Rachel and Tommy deserve that. I deserve that." Walter sighed, but he didn't argue. He knew, just as she did, that there was no turning back now. He had seen too much of the consequences that came from digging into this kind of thing. Joanne had only just begun to scratch the surface of the story, but he understood that if they kept pushing, they would both be stepping into a world where the stakes were higher than either of them had ever imagined. She stepped back, taking in the full scope of the hangar once more. It felt alive with hidden stories, with the ghosts of those who had worked here, who had known things they shouldn't have known, and who had paid the price for their knowledge. The walls of the hangar, once filled with the sounds of planes and machinery, now seemed to echo with the ghosts of lost lives. Rachel and Tommy were part of that, lost to a world that hadn't cared enough to seek the truth. But Joanne would care. She would keep searching until she had answers. "I need to find out who was in charge of this project," Joanne said, more to herself than to Walter, who signed off on this plane, who decided that Rachel and Tommy had to be involved. Walter hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You'll need more than just that plane to figure it out. Whoever's behind this, they've covered their tracks. They've erased records, scrubbed anything that might link them to this." The days that followed were a blur of preparation and planning, each one more fraught with urgency than the last. Joanne had entered a world she couldn't have fathomed before. What started as a search for the truth about Rachel and Tommy's disappearance had spiraled into something far more complex, something that threatened to consume her entirely. The more she learned, the more the world she thought she understood began to dissolve. The shadows were deeper than she ever imagined, and the forces at play were far beyond her reach. At least, they seemed to be. As much as Joanne wanted to step back, to take a moment to breathe and process everything, she couldn't. Not when the stakes were this high. Not when Rachel's voice, the one she'd been hearing in her mind for years, demanded answers, and Tommy's family, too, deserved to know why their son had been taken from them. The truth wasn't something she could walk away from. It was something that was always there, lurking in the corners of her mind, and the closer she came to uncovering it, the more it seemed to claw its way into her thoughts, into her bones. Walter had remained by her side through it all, though she could sense his hesitation, his fear. He was no stranger to the murky world of military secrets and covert operations, but Joanne was venturing into territory that even he seemed unwilling to tread for too long. There were things he had seen, things he had experienced during his time working at the base, things he wished he could unknow, and yet he couldn't walk away. Not when she was determined to push forward. They began to gather information, piecing together every fragment they could find. The base, long abandoned, was the key. Everything pointed to the fact that Rachel and Tommy had been caught up in a military project that was classified, dangerous, and buried beneath layers of government secrecy. Walter had been able to access old files, records that had long been sealed or destroyed. But even with his help, the pieces of the puzzle were few and far between. It wasn't just the plane that held the answers. It was the people involved, the higher-ups who had orchestrated everything. The plane had been the last piece of a much larger operation, one that had gone off course long before Rachel and Tommy ever set foot in the cockpit. Joanne's nights had become filled with restless research, hours spent combing through old documents, reaching out to former military personnel who had worked at the base during its active years. Every conversation was a risk. Every piece of information felt like a breadcrumb leading her into a labyrinth that had been intentionally obscured. She knew she couldn't do this alone, and Walter's presence gave her a sense of grounding, but she couldn't help feeling as though they were both on the edge of something much darker, something that neither of them could control. As she sat at her kitchen table one evening, her laptop open in front of her, the pale light of the screen illuminating her tired face, she found herself reading through an old government report, a document that had somehow surfaced during her investigation. It spoke of the military's long-standing interest in experimental aircraft, their attempts to develop technology that could revolutionize warfare. But as she read, her mind began to piece together something more sinister. The report wasn't just a description of a project. It was a record of failed experiments, crashes, and the people who had disappeared during these covert missions. Names she didn't recognize, dates she couldn't understand, and most of all, the sheer number of people who had been involved in the program. People who had vanished into the shadows, just like Rachel and Tommy. The words began to blur together, the lines between what she knew and what she didn't know growing thinner. She could feel herself slipping deeper into the web of this conspiracy. There were no clear answers, no neat lines to follow. It was as though the more she uncovered, the less she understood. The document hinted at something much larger than she could have imagined, something tied to a global network of powerful entities, all working in the shadows to keep the truth hidden. And yet, despite the mounting evidence, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the surface, that the real story lay deeper than any of them had anticipated. At times, Joanne felt herself being swallowed by the weight of it all. The gravity of what she was uncovering pressed down on her chest, suffocating her. It was as though she was running towards something that would destroy her. The realization that Rachel and Tommy had been mere pawns in a larger, deadly game was almost more than she could bear. They had never known the full extent of the operation they had been involved in. They had never understood the danger, but it was all too clear now. They had been caught in the wake of something far more dangerous than anything they could have imagined. And now, Joanne was tangled in it as well. Walter had tried to urge her to be careful. He had warned her that some doors, once opened, couldn't be closed. But Joanne couldn't turn back. She couldn't give up now, not when she was so close to understanding the truth. The military base, the aircraft, the secretive project. It was all connected, a chain of events that had begun long before Rachel and Tommy's plane had disappeared into the sky. They had been set up to fail, caught in a web of secrecy and lies. And their deaths had been a result of that. Not some random accident, but a deliberate act of erasure. Despite the danger, despite the threats that she was sure were closing in on her, Joanne felt a fierce sense of determination. She had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. The truth had a price, and she was willing to pay it. But she had to get it out. She had to make sure that someone, somewhere, knew what had really happened to Rachel and Tommy. The world needed to know that these lives hadn't been wasted, that they had mattered, that they had been caught in the crossfire of a much bigger, far more insidious operation. The days had become indistinguishable from one another, a blur of frantic research, long nights, and fleeting moments of silence that gave Joanne a space to digest the enormity of what she was diving into. Her once quiet, familiar world had been upended. The mundane had slipped away, replaced by an obsession that had consumed her. Rachel's absence was still the center of her grief, but now it was the truth she sought, something so much larger, so much darker than she could have ever imagined. The more she uncovered, the deeper the abyss she seemed to fall into. Each answer she found only led her to more questions, each piece of the puzzle revealing another layer of complexity, of betrayal, of danger. Her mind had become a labyrinth, filled with names, dates, and classified projects she barely understood but knew were crucial. The hangar, the aircraft, the reports, each of them was a thread that led her to a tangled web, stretching far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. Rachel and Tommy had been nothing more than pawns in a game they never knew they were playing. But what game had they been a part of? What had they unknowingly flown into the path of? These were the questions that kept Joan awake, that gnawed at her insides like a hunger she couldn't feed. Walter had been an unlikely ally, but he was the only one she had. His knowledge, though not complete, was invaluable, and his warnings were the weight that kept her grounded. He knew more about the base, about the project, than he had ever let on before. But the truth was slippery, always just out of reach. She had no idea who she could trust anymore, no way of knowing who might be watching, waiting to silence her before she got too close. Still, every conversation she had, every fragment of information she uncovered, only reinforced her belief that she was on the right path. She wouldn't stop now. There was no going back. Not after everything she had learned. The haunting images of Rachel, young and alive, flashed in her mind every time she sat down to sift through the growing pile of documents, files, and testimonies. Joan had always known her daughter was special. Rachel had always had a kind of quiet determination, a thirst for adventure that matched her skills. It was why she had become a pilot in the first place. But to think that Rachel had been drawn into something so enormous, so clandestine, was almost impossible to fathom. The plane they had found, the one hidden away in that hangar, was just the first piece of the puzzle. There were more pieces, more lies that had been woven around her daughter, around Tommy, around everything they had known. The deeper she dug, the more she uncovered about the program Rachel and Tommy had unknowingly been a part of, and the more she realized that their disappearance was no accident. As Joanne continued to dig, it became clear that Rachel and Tommy's roles in the operation had been more significant than anyone had led her to believe. They had been tasked with flying the prototype aircraft. An experimental plane, yes, but it wasn't just about flying it. It was about testing it, proving it, and ultimately becoming part of something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. What had started as a routine mission had quickly spiraled into something far beyond their control. The more Joan uncovered about the plane's design, the more she realized that it wasn't just about technology. It was about control, power. The military-industrial complex at its darkest. The more information she gathered, the more isolated she felt. There were no easy answers, and the deeper she ventured, the more the shadowy figures behind the operation seemed to close in on her. They were everywhere. At least, that's how it felt. Every time she thought she had a lead, it would slip away. Every time she reached out to someone for help, they would fall silent, disappear, or become too scared to speak. It was as though she was uncovering something that wasn't meant to see the light of day, and those who had once been in the know were now too afraid to offer even the smallest breadcrumb of truth. But Joanne wouldn't be intimidated. She couldn't afford to be. There was too much at stake. Her mind continued to circle around the central question: who had been in charge? Who had orchestrated the operation, and why had it been kept secret for so long? Each file she read, each report she scoured, pointed to a group of high-ranking individuals, people who had ties to both military and corporate sectors. The more she learned, the more it became clear that Rachel and Tommy hadn't just stumbled into a dangerous mission. They had been chosen. The question was why. What had they been meant to uncover? Or worse, what had they been meant to erase? It wasn't just the plane that mattered. It wasn't just the technology or the project that Rachel and Tommy had been unknowingly caught in. It was the people who had signed off on it, the people who had ensured that the mission would be carried out without anyone ever knowing what had really happened. It was those people who were the true enemies now, the shadowy figures who pulled the strings, who manipulated events from behind closed doors, who had the power to make sure that Rachel and Tommy's deaths were just another footnote in the larger story. Joan wasn't about to let that happen. In the days that followed, she reached out to anyone who might have had knowledge of the project, or even a small connection to the base. She made phone calls, sent emails, met with people in dimly lit cafes and abandoned parking lots, always aware of the risks. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't let this go. And slowly, very slowly, she began to piece together the names of those who had been involved, the ones who had played a direct role in the operation. They weren't easy to find, but they were out there. And once she had their names, once she had the connections between them, she could start to put the puzzle together. She could begin to understand the full scope of the program. And most importantly, the people who had decided that Rachel and Tommy had to disappear. The tension in the air was palpable. Each passing moment, a heavy reminder of how far Joan had come and how much farther she had to go. She was no longer just a grieving mother. She had become something else. Something stronger, more determined, more willing to sacrifice. The labyrinth of secrecy and lies she had been navigating for months had revealed parts of the truth, but the answers she sought still felt elusive, like shadows just out of reach. It was as if the deeper she dug, the more the conspiracy expanded, wrapping itself around her tighter and tighter. She had crossed a line that she could never uncross, and there was no way to turn back. Every lead she had followed, every name she had uncovered, led her to the same conclusion. This was bigger than just Rachel and Tommy. Their deaths had been part of something much more sinister, something that spanned across decades, rooted in a system that used people like them, innocent, naive, skilled, but ultimately expendable. She couldn't let their deaths be buried under the weight of that secrecy. She wouldn't let it. But as the walls closed in, as the danger became more real, the fear began to gnaw at her. It was one thing to seek the truth. It was another to realize that the truth had the power to destroy everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for. She had uncovered something she could never have imagined, a covert operation that had been kept hidden from the world, one that spanned across government agencies, military operations, and corporate interests, with people in high places willing to kill to protect it. And Rachel and Tommy had been caught in the crossfire of that operation, victims of a system that didn't care who it hurt as long as the truth remained buried. Joanne's thoughts circled back to the plane, the prototype, the secret project that had somehow become central to everything. She had seen the photographs. She had read the reports. And now she understood what had happened that fateful day when Rachel and Tommy had been sent to fly the plane. They hadn't just been involved in a test flight. They had been part of a much darker mission, a mission that was about more than just military power or technological advancement. It was about control over information, over resources, over people. Rachel and Tommy had been the means to an end. Nothing more than pawns in a game they hadn't even known they were playing. Walter had warned her repeatedly about the risks of pushing too hard, but the words never seemed to sink in. There was no stopping now. The closer she came to the truth, the more it consumed her, the more it became her obsession. She had always known, deep down, that there were things the world wasn't telling her, things the government wasn't telling her about Rachel's disappearance. But now, she realized that the system wasn't just withholding information. It was actively erasing the people who had dared to expose the truth. Rachel and Tommy had died because they had stumbled upon something they were never meant to uncover, something so dangerous that it had cost them their lives. And Joan wasn't about to let their deaths be swept under the rug. The more she learned, the more the danger seemed to escalate. Her contacts grew fewer and fewer as the word spread that someone was getting too close to the truth. The families of other victims who had disappeared in the same mysterious circumstances had begun to reach out to her, desperate for answers. They were all searching for closure, for justice, for a way to make sense of senseless. Joan knew she couldn't solve this alone, but it felt as though she had no choice. Each conversation was a calculated risk, each call and email a potential trap. And still, she pressed on. The turning point came one evening, as she sat alone in the dim light of her apartment, surrounded by papers, files, and photographs. Her phone buzzed, an anonymous number flashing on the screen. It had become routine to receive cryptic messages, some threatening, others simply warning her to stop. But this call felt different. Something in her gut told her that this time it was real. She answered it, her pulse racing. The voice on the other end was low, distorted, but unmistakably urgent. "You're getting too close, Joanne. You need to stop. They're watching you. They've been watching you for weeks." Her heart skipped a beat, the words sinking in like a cold stone. The feeling of being hunted, of being tracked, was no longer abstract. It was real. The truth she had been chasing had put her squarely in the crosshairs of the people behind the operation. "I'm not stopping," Joanne said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly. "I'm not backing down." There was a long pause on the other end, the silence thick with tension. "You don't understand. It's bigger than you. It's bigger than all of us. If you keep digging, they'll bury you, Joanne. You'll never see it coming." She was silent for a moment, the weight of the warning sinking into her bones. But she couldn't back down now, not when she was so close. "I'll take my chances,"